Welcome once again to the Dewayne Dunaway Show. We sure are glad that you have chosen to join us. And I have said that women can do anything in ministry and service to God that men can do. And some have reacted very negatively to that and have pressed me to try to explain Paul's words in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and also in Titus chapter 1 about the, quote, qualifications for leaders. And they say, well, if it's true that women can be preachers, then what do you do with Paul's instructions there? They think that it's an insurmountable difficulty to what I'm teaching. But there are several things to keep in mind about those two texts, and I'll call them qualifications. There's nothing wrong with that. But number one, and here may be the most important point of all, this may be the thing that we need to remember. Paul was not writing those instructions to any denomination, no denominational congregation, no denominational group. And so I want to say this kindly, but if you are a part of a man-made denomination, then I don't want to hear anything that you have to say about Paul's qualifications there, because he was not writing them to you and he was not writing them to your group, because Jesus never established a denomination and Paul never sanctioned a denomination. And so you're taking words that were written to just simple New Testament congregations that were based on the doctrine of Jesus and the apostles, and you're applying them to something that they have nothing to do with. Paul did not establish denominations, and so he did not write to denominations. He's writing those instructions to the churches that were established based on what Acts 2:42 calls the apostles' doctrine. You cannot ever get a denomination by just teaching the apostles' doctrine, which is really the doctrine of Christ through the apostles. All right, so those texts do not apply to your group. He's not talking to you at all. So if you are a part of a man-made denomination, then I say this kindly, and I know that you might disagree with me. And that's okay. I'm not going to get offended if you disagree. You may get offended at what I'm going to say. But if you really cared what Paul thought about anything or what Paul wrote about anything, then you would not be a part of a man-made denomination. Because, again, he not only did not sanction them, he actually condemned the very concept of them in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. So whatever Paul is saying about church leaders, he's not talking about church leaders in any denomination. So I don't have to explain anything to anyone who would try to use them in that way. Secondly, and this is important as well, there is a lot of delusion in the world of denominational thinking. And one problem that people have is that they do not recognize that Paul is not even talking to preachers there. He's not talking about who can preach. When he talks about church leaders, he's talking about seasoned people, older men, if you want to go that route for now, that are to be shepherds. They are to be overseers. They are to look after people and help them grow in their simple faith in Christ. It's a very simple approach. It gets complicated when you start, again, applying it to man-made denominations to which they were never intended to be applied. Those words were not intended to be applied. So in most denominations, you have the pastor who is sort of over the church. And the pastor and the preacher are the same person. Well, Paul wrote to a preacher, Timothy. He wrote to a preacher, Titus, and gave them these, quote, qualifications and told them to establish church leaders. So the preachers were to appoint the church leaders. They were not qualifications for the preachers. All right, and if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand anything that Paul is saying. Titus 1:5, Paul says to Titus, I left you in Crete that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders or bishops, overseers, pastors. They're all describing the same function, the same office, if you will. And then he gives the qualifications. So 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1 were both written to preachers. And they have nothing to do with who can preach. He's talking about leaders in the church, elders, bishops, overseers, shepherds. These are all New Testament descriptions of the same thing, the same people. All right, so those verses have nothing to do with who can preach. So when Paul says, and this is the argument that comes up immediately, Paul said that these people have to be the husband of one wife. Well, it's obvious a woman can't be the husband of one wife, so therefore she can't be the preacher. Well, Paul's not talking about preachers. So even if you interpret those passages that way, then it still has nothing to do with whether or not a woman can preach, because he's not talking about who can preach. He's talking about who oversees the flock, and he's not even talking about who oversees a local congregation, because in denominational thinking, that's how it's applied, because that is the culture that we have, and people just have trouble thinking outside of that, and they want to read all of that back into the New Testament where it did not exist. Paul's talking about leaders over small churches in cities. I left you there to appoint elders in every city. And even in Acts 14, when he says that, or when the Bible says that the apostles appointed elders in every church, that wasn't talking about a church like a building in a specific location, one congregation. It's talking about the church in the cities, because they were spread out in small groups all over those cities. The idea of church buildings and church signs and church staff and all this other stuff, that is all man-made. All right, so he's not talking about who can preach. The third thing is, and this is very important, and people need to keep this in mind. If we interpret Paul's words there legalistically, just as ironclad rules, there is no one who can be a church leader, because no one lives up to those qualifications. If you interpret them legalistically, there's no one who can even explain what it means that a man is to be the husband of one wife. I have heard so many ridiculous ideas about that, and the reason is because nobody knows for sure what Paul had in mind. I think it's very clear, considering the culture, he's saying that a church leader cannot be a polygamist. There were people who had more than one wives. He says if you're going to be a leader, then you, seems obvious to me, he's saying you don't have time to have multiple wives. You're going to be focused on doing this. But even if I'm wrong about that, I've heard it applied to saying that if a man's been divorced, he can't be a church leader. And yet you look at the people who say that, then there's something on that list that they're not living up to perfectly. It's always used in some negative way to control people, to put somebody else down. It's just all a very silly, sad game. Paul says that the man has to be blameless. And again, if you're taking that legalistically, what does that mean, blameless? That means that nobody has anything negative to say. That means he's never done anything for which he could be accused that would be against the gospel. The one I love is he has to be able to teach. Now, he's not talking about preachers, so you can try to get around that any way you want to, but he's talking about church leaders. So elders, overseers, deacons. When he says that they are to be apt to teach in the King James, able to teach, they're to have the ability to teach. Teach what? I keep asking that, and no one can answer that, because all you can do is give me opinions, because you don't know exactly what Paul meant by that. Does it mean that he has to be able to teach Genesis to Revelation? He has to know all of the Bible? Does it mean that he just has to be able to share the gospel with someone? That would not imply a very seasoned man, a very mature man, if all he could teach was just telling somebody how to become a Christian. If he can't nurture and develop people and teach them what the Bible says about how to live for Christ. So legalistically, you just can't do it. You're going to do it anyway. I know a lot of you're going to keep living in your little box, and you're not going to be confused by the facts, and you're going to keep playing this game. But it is a game. You interpret those things as rules and regulations legalistically. No one lives up to them. So how do we interpret them? In the spirit of the New Testament, we are not under a law like the law of Moses, where everything was spelled out. The spirit of the New Testament is that the New Testament is a book of principles. You try to follow everything exactly the way the early churches did, you will get yourself in all sorts of trouble. because you will focus on some things that you think you understand, and you will completely ignore other things. And every denomination that tries to say that they're following some New Testament pattern in all the relevant ways, all the important ways, however you want to say it, they're so inconsistent, it's not even funny. So how do we interpret them? We interpret them as principles. And when you read them as principles, then it's easy to see what kind of person Paul is describing. But that brings us to another point. If he's dealing in principles, he's writing in a male-dominated culture, in a situation that is not like the situation now. They didn't have women CEOs and women vice presidents and women school teachers and women principals and all these, on and on we could go. It was a completely different culture. What would Paul say today if he were writing to us? In principle, sure, a woman can be exactly the kind of person Paul is describing in those verses. So you got to get off the fence. If you're going to interpret it legalistically, you're never going to be consistent, and you're just going to make a mockery of everything that he said. Take it as principles, then you won't back yourself into all these ridiculous corners. And it'll just be a very simple approach to not only that, but to the New Testament, which is what we are to take. All right, now what about the problem text as far as women preachers? We've dealt with this before, and the problem texts are not problematic at all. They're really very simple. Found in 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians chapter 14. All right, 1 Timothy chapter 2, he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. In 1 Corinthians 14, he says that I want women to keep silent in the churches. All right, so let's just consider the context. First of all, 1 Timothy 2 is, that one is so easy, I don't even know why we have to even deal with that one. There is nothing in the context of 1 Timothy chapter 2 that is talking about preaching or a worship service, as people call them, or even an assembly of any kind. Not even talking about the assemblies that they had. He's talking about life, daily life, Christian life. He says in the first part of the chapter, I want you to pray for church leaders. He's not talking about doing that just in the assembly. He says that women are to adorn themselves in modest apparel. Does that mean that people can dress any way they want to, except when they are assembled in the church gathering? No, there's nothing in that context about an assembly of believers. So whatever he's telling women there would apply to every part of life. So nobody interprets it that way, though, right? I mean, I'm sure there are some fringe groups that do, but no mainline denomination interprets it that way. Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or in any other way to have authority over a man. And yet you send your children to schools where a woman is the principal. You work at jobs where you have, female bosses. I mean, no, we could go with this stuff. Nobody applies it the way that it's written, which is to everyday life. So if he is literally saying that women cannot have authority over a man, he's saying they can't have authority over a man anywhere. And even if he were saying it for that time and culture, then it would only apply to whatever specific situation he was writing to there to Timothy that was taking place in Ephesus. And there's a lot of background that was going on in Ephesus that would probably help you understand some of the things that he said. But here's the key. He's not even talking about women in general. He's talking about wives. In the Greek language, the word for wife and the word for woman is the same word. And so translators come to that word and they have to make a decision based on the context, what they think it's talking about. And they usually take the broader way and translate it women, even though clearly the context is wife. What he is saying is that the wife is not to have authority over her husband, because the example that he gives is the first married couple, Adam and Eve. Now, I will freely admit that I do not understand everything that he says there, because I do not live in Ephesus in the first century. I think they understood what he said. But I don't have to know everything that he did say or understand everything that he did say to know what he's not saying. He's not saying that a woman cannot teach a man, or even that a wife cannot teach her husband. He's talking obviously about a certain kind of attitude in a marriage relationship that would be very detrimental. In fact, I think we need to leave it alone, because the last verse there says that the woman will be saved in childbearing, and nobody on earth knows what he means by that. Okay, so you can give all kinds of theories, but we might as well just come clean and say nobody knows what Paul meant when he said that women shall be saved in childbearing. So we can, give logical explanations and say we think this might be what he means. There's nothing wrong with that. But the best thing to do is just leave it alone, to realize he was writing about a situation in Ephesus that was going on, and there were some women in that particular case who were not acting right. They were not acting the way that Christians should act. He got on men a lot of times too, and so in this case he's talking about women. So the principle there is that women and men are to love and respect each other. The principles that are found in Ephesians chapter 5 would not be negated by anything he would say in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So just look for the principles and keep your focus on Christ and act like a Christian, and nothing Paul says there in 1 Timothy chapter 2 will even come into play in your life. All right, so nothing about a church assembly there in 1 Timothy chapter 2, nothing about her standing up in front of a group preaching. That has nothing to do with it. You tell me what he means by she shall be saved in childbearing, and then you can press me to try to explain everything that he said in that context. I don't understand everything that he said, but again, I was not there, and I don't know what the problem was, and I don't know exactly what those women were doing that caused him to say that. I know that Paul was not misogynistic. I know that he was not saying what the denominations say and teach. It just won't hold up at all. All right, then the other one, 1 Corinthians 14, it may be even easier to explain, because he tells three groups of people, I should say, in that chapter to be quiet in the church gathering. Now, Christians did assemble, and I've told you before, Hebrews 10:25, we should assemble and meet with other believers. We just don't have to, quote, go to church in these religious denominations. That's not what he's talking about there. But in that gathering, they were acting like a bunch of nuts, and he wrote some corrective teaching, you might say, to this group. If they had been behaving, there would be nothing in the New Testament like 1 Corinthians chapter 14, because it was written in response to things they were doing wrong. And so he tells three different groups to keep silent in that chapter. If there is a tongue speaker who does not have an interpreter, keep silent. That does not apply today because people cannot speak in tongues today. And so, whether or not they have an interpreter is irrelevant because they're not really speaking in tongues. Now, I know a lot of people watching this disagree with me, and I'm not your judge. You're not my judge, but I'm just telling you that's what I believe. I don't believe anyone is speaking in tongues today because, as he says in 1 Corinthians 13, he had already said those gifts were temporary. We have something today that they don't have, and that is the New Testament scriptures. Second group he says to keep silent is prophets. If it's not your turn to prophesy, then you are to keep silent. And then he makes this statement. He says, and the women are to keep silent in the churches. And what's interesting about that is that the same Greek term is used in all three of those cases, and it means to not make a sound. We would say it rudely. If we were talking rudely, we would tell someone to shut up, don't make a sound. That's what he's saying. Sit down and be quiet. So that word literally means don't make a sound. Every church I know that tells women to keep silent based on 1 Corinthians 14 allows women to sing, because even they know that would be a ridiculous way to interpret it. I'm saying it's a ridiculous way to interpret it, to say that they cannot preach, or to even say that he's talking about all women. He's talking about some women in Ephesus, and this one is really clear. Remember, the Greek word for wife and the Greek word for woman, same word. So even though most translations translate it as let your women keep silent, that one should definitely be translated as let your wives keep silent. And he's talking about the wives of the prophets. Because in the very next statement, what does he say? If they have questions, let them ask their husbands at home. Can't be talking about all women, because all women do not have husbands. He's talking about wives of the prophets who, it's obvious to me, were interrupting the assembly in some way. So he's not even talking to all wives. He's not even telling all wives to keep silent. He's talking to a specific group that were causing problems and not acting very Christ-like in the assembly. So when you look at it all simply according to principles, the Bible is not nearly as confusing as you try to make it. When you listen to these man-made religious groups who have to have these laws to keep things, quote, in order, the way that they want to run them, then that's when it gets confusing. A lot of people are not going to like the things that I've said, definitely not going to agree with it, going to call me names, all that, that doesn't mean anything. That's irrelevant what you say about me personally. But you won't be able to answer the arguments. You won't be able to deal with the things that I have dealt with here, because there's just no way to be consistent if you try to interpret these things legalistically and try to say that women cannot preach. And I don't even think it's right to say they cannot be church leaders, elders, pastors, all these other things. So anyway, certainly something to think about. Those of you who truly want to know what the New Testament teaches about it, who are focused on Christ and just want to please Christ, then it's going to be hard to argue with that simplistic explanation, because, it's not mine. There are plenty of people a lot smarter than I am, a lot more knowledgeable in the Bible than I am, that would tell you the exact same thing. That's not some new interpretation. It's just that you don't hear it a lot of times because men want to control things in these man-made denominations. Anyway, stay with the Word of God. Stay focused on Jesus. We appreciate your time. Always appreciate you joining us here on the Dewayne Dunaway Show. And don't forget, if you are able to, you appreciate the videos and would like to donate to the ministry, the link to do that is in my bio. We look forward to seeing you next time here on the podcast on YouTube that we call the Dewayne Dunaway Show.